On February 22, 2014, when protesters finally broke through the gates of Mezhyhirya, they discovered something that would forever change their understanding of governmental corruption. In the master bathroom of the main residence stood a toilet encrusted with what appeared to be Byzantine-style golden mosaics gleaming under crystal chandeliers. Nearby, investigators found a golden bread loaf, an actual loaf-shaped object made of solid gold, and a kilogram gold coin bearing the face of Ukraine's president. The yacht dock could accommodate vessels worth tens of millions. The private zoo, shooting ranges, tennis courts, and 140 hectares of manicured grounds represented a level of wealth that seemed impossible for a public servant. But perhaps most disturbing was this. The man who built this palace of excess had started his adult life not in politics or business, but in a juvenile detention center, convicted of violent robbery as a teenage member of Donetsk's notorious street gangs. Viktor Yanukovych was born on July 9, 1950, in the small mining town of Yanukovych in Ukraine's industrial Donetsk region. His early years were marked by poverty and abandonment that would have broken many children. His mother died when he was only 2 years old. His father remarried, but the new wife refused to accept the boy into their home. Young Viktor was sent to live with his grandmother in conditions of severe deprivation. The Donbas region in the 1950s was a harsh environment: coal mines, steel factories, and a culture where physical strength often mattered more than education. In this world, boys like Yanukovych had limited options: work the mines or find other ways to survive. By his teenage years, Yanukovych had fallen in with a local criminal group known as Pivnovka, a street gang that operated in the Yanukovych area. The gang's activities ranged from petty theft to violent robberies. On December 15, 1967, just 17 years old, Yanukovych participated in a robbery that would result in his first criminal conviction. The court found him guilty under Article 141, Part 2 of the Ukrainian SSR Criminal Code, robbery committed by a group. The sentence, 3 years in a juvenile correctional facility. He was sent to a colony in Kremenchuk, a city in central Ukraine, far from his Donbas home. Prison records show that young Yanukovych did not serve his full sentence. He spent approximately 19 months behind bars before being released early under an amnesty, declared to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution. The prison administration reportedly supported his early release, citing his exemplary behavior during incarceration. Whether this represented genuine rehabilitation or simply survival skills within the prison system remains a matter of debate. What is certain is that the experience left its mark, both literally in his criminal record and figuratively in shaping his understanding of power, violence, and the importance of connections. But Yanukovych's criminal career was not finished. After his release, he returned to Donetsk and found work at the Yanukovych metallurgical plant as a gas worker. It seemed, briefly, that he might be attempting to build a legitimate life. That hope lasted less than 2 years. On June 8, 1970, just a month before his 20th birthday, Yanukovych was arrested again. This time, the charge was causing medium-severity bodily harm under Article 102 of the Criminal Code. The circumstances of the assault were never fully clarified in public records. Yanukovych and his defenders would later claim he was protecting a young woman from a drunk aggressor, painting himself as a knight-errant rather than a street thug. Prosecutors and victims told a different story of unprovoked violence. The court sided with the prosecution. The sentence, 2 years imprisonment. The pretrial investigation and court proceedings dragged on for 9 months before the verdict was finalized. By 1972, Viktor Yanukovych had spent significant portions of his late teens and early 20s in Soviet correctional facilities. He had 2 felony convictions on his permanent record. Under Soviet law, this essentially barred him from any position of responsibility or trust. He could not attend university. He could not work in government. He could not travel abroad. He was, for all practical purposes, a marked man whose criminal past would follow him for the rest of his life. Except that it didn't. In 1973, just 1 year after completing his second sentence, something remarkable happened. A local court in Yanukovych, responding to what was described as a petition from his labor collective, agreed to remove both of Yanukovych's convictions ahead of the normal statute of limitations. But this was just the beginning. On December 27, 1978, the Donetsk Regional Court issued a stunning ruling. Both previous convictions were not merely expunged or forgiven. They were declared void, cancelled due to absence of criminal elements in the original cases. In other words, the court ruled that the crimes for which Yanukovych had been convicted and imprisoned never actually happened. This is where the story takes its first turn into the realm of mystery and conspiracy. According to widespread reports that emerged decades later, the man who made this legal miracle possible was Georgy Beregovoy, a genuine Soviet hero, a cosmonaut who had flown on Soyuz 3 in 1968 and, by the late 1970s, a deputy in the USSR Supreme Soviet. Beregovoy allegedly petitioned the Donetsk court directly, asking them to overturn Yanukovych's convictions. Why would a famous cosmonaut involve himself in the legal troubles of an obscure ex-convict from a Donbass mining town? The official explanation, when one was offered at all, was that Beregovoy had been impressed by Yanukovych's reform and his work at the metallurgical plant. Critics suggested darker possibilities: that Yanukovych had become an informant for the KGB, that his convictions were being erased as part of a deal, that the whole arrangement stank of Soviet-era corruption, where connections mattered more than justice. The mystery deepens further. No documentary evidence of Beregovoy's petition has ever been found. When journalists and investigators went looking for the original court files in the 2000s, they discovered anomalies. Pages appeared to have been inserted into archived case files. Some documents seemed to have been recreated rather than preserved. In 2005, after Yanukovych's first failed presidential bid, Ukraine's General Prosecutor's Office launched an investigation into possible falsification of the court records. The investigation found nothing. Or rather, it found that there was no basis to pursue criminal charges. The files, authentic or not, showed what they showed. Yanukovych's record was clean. This clean slate changed everything. In 1974, remarkably, Yanukovych had been able to travel abroad to participate in a rally in Monte Carlo, something that should have been impossible for someone with active criminal convictions in the Soviet system. By the 1980s, he was advancing in the Communist Party, eventually earning membership in 1980. He worked his way up through various transportation and logistics enterprises in the Donbass region. In 1996, 22 years after his convictions were erased, Yanukovych was appointed deputy chairman of the Donetsk Regional State Administration. The following year, he became chairman, effectively the governor of one of Ukraine's most important regions. The former teenage gang member was now a major political figure. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We need to return to a specific place and a specific moment that would define Yanukovych's legacy even more than his criminal past: the estate known as Mezhyhirya. Mezhyhirya's history stretches back to the Soviet era, when it served as a government dacha, a retreat for high-ranking Communist Party officials. During different periods, it hosted Ukrainian Soviet leaders, including Nikita Khrushchev and Vladimir Sherbitsky. The 140-hectare compound sits on the banks of the Dnipro River, about 10 kilometers north of Kyiv, in the village of Novi Petrivtsi. Surrounded by forest, with river access and natural beauty, it was always a privileged space, but nothing like what it would become. When Yanukovych first became prime minister in 2002, he was granted use of a small house on the Mezhyhirya grounds, officially listed as House Number 20, a modest 325 square meters. Over the following years, through a complex series of legal maneuvers, the entire estate was gradually transferred from state ownership into private hands. The key entity in this transfer was a company called Tantalit LLC, which Ukrainian investigative journalists conclusively linked to Yanukovych's family and close associates. In 2007, during Yanukovych's second term as prime minister, President Viktor Yushchenko signed a classified decree that essentially gave Yanukovych long-term rights to the Mezhyhirya complex. Why Yushchenko, a political opponent, would do this remains controversial. Some speculated it was part of a political deal. Others suggested outright bribery. What followed was one of the most audacious examples of state asset theft in modern European history. Using government funds channeled through various agencies and front companies, Yanukovych transformed Mezhyhirya from a government dacha into a private palace complex that rivaled anything built by Russian oligarchs. The scale of construction was staggering. Workers cleared waterways, built private roads, including a smooth asphalt highway leading directly to the estate entrance, and erected multiple buildings across the vast property. The perimeter was secured with a 5-meter-high iron fence that ran for kilometers, monitored by cameras and patrolled by security personnel from elite units. The main residence became the crown jewel of this kingdom of corruption. Multiple stories of marble and expensive wood, with rooms dedicated to every conceivable luxury. The famous golden bathroom, with its Byzantine mosaic toilet, was just one of many such rooms. Chandeliers worth hundreds of thousands of dollars hung in hallways. Floors were inlaid with rare woods and stones. Every fixture, every decoration, every piece of furniture screamed excess. But Mezhyhirya was more than just a house. It was a complete alternate reality for a man who had grown up in poverty. The grounds included a private zoo, stocked with exotic animals including ostriches and peacocks. There was a professional shooting range for sport hunting practice, tennis courts built to international competition standards, a professional golf course maintained by a permanent staff, multiple guest houses for hosting visitors, each appointed with the same attention to luxury as the main building. The yacht dock could accommodate vessels worth tens of millions of dollars. Yanukovych was known to own at least one significant yacht that was moored there. There was even a small church built on the grounds, its golden domes visible from the river. The equestrian facilities were particularly elaborate. Stables housing thoroughbred horses, a covered riding arena, and trails through the private forests. Yanukovych had developed a passion for horses, and the complex reflected this obsession. Connected to Mezhyhirya were hunting grounds in the surrounding forests, where Yanukovych and his guests could pursue game in complete privacy. Everything was designed to allow the president and his inner circle to live in a bubble of absolute privilege, completely disconnected from the reality of ordinary Ukrainians. The cost of building and maintaining this empire is difficult to calculate, precisely because so much of it was hidden through shell companies and off-book payments. Conservative estimates place the total investment at well over $100 million, though some investigators believe the true figure could be 2 or 3 times higher. Almost all of this money came directly or indirectly from the Ukrainian state budget, either through literal theft of government funds or through corrupt deals where state contracts were awarded to Yanukovych-connected companies that then kicked back portions of their profits to fund the construction. One particularly elaborate scheme involved the Sukoluchia estate, a separate but related property. In 2007, while serving as Prime Minister, Yanukovych orchestrated the seizure of 17.5 hectares of land that belonged to the Dnipro-Teteriv forestry and hunting estate. The scheme worked through front companies and sympathetic local officials. Individuals connected to Yanukovych would submit applications to the Kiev Regional Administration requesting plots of land. Once the land was allocated to these individuals, they would immediately apply to change its legal designation from protected forest to recreational use. The plots would then be consolidated and transferred to a company Yanukovych controlled. Between 2009 and 2011, a hotel and restaurant complex was built on this land, valued at approximately 22 million hryvnias. Yanukovych used this facility as a personal hunting retreat. But perhaps nothing symbolizes the corruption of the Yanukovych era more than the treasure trove of cultural artifacts discovered at Mezhyhirya after his flight. When investigators finally cataloged the contents of the residence in 2014 and subsequent years, they documented 537 items of significant cultural and monetary value, with a total estimated worth of 18.7 million euros. This was not a collection assembled by a connoisseur with refined taste. It was the hoard of a magpie, grabbing everything shiny and expensive without regard for art or history. The collection included rare 19th-century religious icons, some of which had been reported missing from Ukrainian churches and museums. There were paintings by recognized masters, both Ukrainian and foreign, antique furniture from various European periods, chairs, tables, cabinets that belonged in museums rather than private residences, ornate clocks from the 18th and 19th centuries worth tens of thousands of euros each, decorative vases and pottery, some of significant archaeological value, ceremonial weapons, sabers, rifles, even a 19th-century cannon that appeared to have been either stolen from state collections or purchased illegally on the black market. Every item in this collection represented not just monetary value, but a story of corruption. Each piece had been acquired either through direct theft of state property or through purchase using embezzled government funds. Some of the religious items may have been extorted from churches or monasteries that needed government approval for construction or renovation. The antique weapons almost certainly came from military museums or state armories. The paintings and furniture could have been funding Ukrainian museums and cultural institutions instead of decorating a corrupt president's palace. Yanukovych's defenders, in the years since his flight, have attempted to argue that he was simply a successful businessman who accumulated wealth legitimately. This claim is absurd on its face. Yanukovych's official salary as president was approximately 7,000 euros per month, substantial by Ukrainian standards, but nowhere near sufficient to fund the lifestyle evident at Mezhyhirya. Even if one added his previous government salaries and assumed he had saved every kopeck from age 18 onward, the math does not work. The only way to accumulate the wealth on display was through systematic corruption, taking bribes, stealing state assets, awarding government contracts to friendly companies in exchange for kickbacks, and using his position to acquire property at favorable terms or simply seize it outright. The scale of corruption went far beyond Mezhyhirya itself. During Yanukovych's presidency from 2010 to 2014, corruption permeated every level of Ukrainian government. Transparency International ranked Ukraine as one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. Businesses complained that every interaction with government officials required bribes to get permits, to pass inspections, to win contracts. The judicial system was thoroughly compromised, with judges appointed based on loyalty rather than competence. Law enforcement agencies, from traffic police to prosecutors, operated as tools of the ruling party rather than as servants of justice. Yanukovych's inner circle, often referred to as the family, consisted of his two sons and a small group of oligarchs and officials who enriched themselves alongside him. His son Alexander became particularly notorious. Through various business entities, Alexander accumulated a fortune estimated at over $1 billion by 2014. He controlled banks, insurance companies, and most profitably, companies involved in importing and distributing Russian natural gas. These businesses thrived on government contracts and regulatory advantages that effectively eliminated competition. When ordinary Ukrainians paid their utility bills, a portion of that money was flowing into Alexander Yanukovych's accounts. The younger son, Viktor, took a different path but was equally involved in questionable activities. He worked in the parliament and held positions in various business enterprises. Tragically for the Yanukovych family, Viktor died in March 2015 in a bizarre accident on Lake Baikal in Russia. He was on a recreational trip when his van drove onto the ice of the frozen lake. The ice broke and the vehicle sank. Viktor Yanukovych drowned. The exact circumstances remain unclear, whether it was a simple accident, whether alcohol was involved, whether there was some element of foul play. The Yanukovych family, by then living in Russian exile, mourned privately. The death removed one potential heir to the Yanukovych fortune and political legacy. By late 2013, Viktor Yanukovych stood at the absolute peak of his power. He controlled Ukraine's executive branch. The parliament was dominated by his party of regions. The courts bent to his will. Law enforcement agencies answered to him personally. The enormous wealth accumulated through corruption was secured in properties, bank accounts, and business holdings both in Ukraine and abroad. Mezhyhirya stood as a monument to how far he had come from that juvenile detention center in Kremenchug. From teenage gang member to master of a nation of 45 million people. But there were cracks in the facade. The Ukrainian economy was struggling, weighed down by corruption and mismanagement. Ordinary citizens saw their living standards stagnate, while the elite flaunted wealth. Young Ukrainians looked at Poland, at the Baltic states, and saw what was possible when countries chose European integration over post-Soviet kleptocracy. Civil society organizations were becoming more vocal and organized. Opposition politicians, though harassed and sometimes imprisoned, continued to challenge the regime. And then came the decision that would end everything. The choice not to sign the association agreement with the European Union. For months, Yanukovych's government had been negotiating this agreement, which would have moved Ukraine closer to European institutions and away from Russia's orbit. Many Ukrainians saw this as their country's destiny, to finally break free from Russian influence and join the prosperous, democratic European community. The agreement was scheduled to be signed at an EU summit in Vilnius on November 29, 2013. On November 21st, just days before the summit, Yanukovych's government suddenly announced it was suspending preparations for signing the agreement. The official reason was economic pressure from Russia, which had threatened trade sanctions if Ukraine moved forward. But everyone understood the real dynamic. Vladimir Putin had made clear that he would not accept Ukraine joining the European sphere, and Yanukovych, who had always been closer to Russia culturally and politically, had chosen to comply with Moscow's wishes rather than his own people's aspirations. The reaction was immediate. That very evening, hundreds of protesters gathered in Kiev's Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square. They were mostly students and young professionals, angry that their country's European future was being sacrificed to maintain good relations with Russia. The initial gathering was small, peaceful, almost spontaneous. Nobody, including the protesters themselves, imagined what was about to unfold. Nobody could have predicted that this decision would lead to revolution, to Yanukovych's flight, to war, and ultimately to hundreds of thousands of deaths. As November turned to December, the protests grew. Thousands, then tens of thousands of people filled the Maidan and the surrounding streets. The movement attracted not just young people, but Ukrainians of all ages and backgrounds who were tired of corruption, tired of authoritarian governance, tired of being told their country belonged in Russia's sphere of influence rather than choosing its own path. They built a tent city in the square. They organized kitchens and medical tents. They created a community of resistance. And Viktor Yanukovych, sitting in his palace at Mezhyhirya, surrounded by his golden toilets and stolen artwork, made the catastrophic decision to crush this movement by force. The violent suppression began in the early morning hours of November 30th, 2013. Special police units moved into the Maidan while most protesters were sleeping. The Berkut, Ukraine's riot police, known for their brutality, waded into the tent city with batons swinging. They beat students unconscious. They dragged young women by their hair across the pavement. They kicked protesters who had already fallen. Cell phone videos captured the savagery and spread across social media within hours. Instead of ending the protests, the beatings transformed them. What had been a relatively small gathering of mostly young people became a mass movement that drew in hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians outraged by the violence against peaceful demonstrators. By December, the Maidan had become a fortress. Protesters erected barricades from whatever materials they could find: tires, sandbags, ice blocks, scrap metal. They wore hard hats and carried improvised shields. Self-defense units formed to protect the camp from police raids. The movement's demands evolved beyond the EU agreement to include fundamental political reforms: Yanukovych's resignation, new elections, prosecution of officials responsible for violence, constitutional changes to limit presidential power. The government's response alternated between attempts at dialogue and escalating force. Neither worked. Throughout December and January, violence flared periodically. Police would advance on the barricades. Protesters would throw stones and Molotov cocktails. Security forces would respond with rubber bullets and tear gas. Several protesters were kidnapped, beaten, and left in forests outside the city, a tactic clearly designed to terrorize the movement. Some activists simply disappeared. In mid-January, the parliament rammed through a package of laws, quickly dubbed dictatorship laws, that essentially criminalized protest. Wearing a helmet at a demonstration could bring criminal charges. Unauthorized tent camps were banned. Defaming government officials online became a crime. The laws were so obviously authoritarian that even some of Yanukovych's own Party of Regions members opposed them. The dictatorship laws backfired spectacularly. Instead of cowing the opposition, they brought even more people into the streets. Protests spread beyond Kyiv to other Ukrainian cities. Demonstrators seized government buildings in western Ukraine. The standoff intensified. By late January, the government partially repealed the new laws and accepted the resignation of the prime minister in an attempt to diffuse tensions. It was too little, too late. The protesters now demanded nothing less than Yanukovych's complete removal from power. February 18, 2014, marked the beginning of the end. That morning, protesters marched from the Maidan toward the Parliament building. Their goal was to pressure the legislature to restore the 2004 Constitution, which would have significantly reduced presidential powers. The march included tens of thousands of people. Peaceful demonstrators mixed with more militant activists who had grown tired of negotiations. As the column approached Parliament, they encountered police lines. Exactly what happened next remains disputed, but violence exploded. Molotov cocktails arced through the air. Gunfire erupted. By the end of the day, at least 25 people were dead, both protesters and police officers. That evening, security forces launched a major assault on the Maidan itself. Berkut units, supported by Interior Ministry troops, advanced on the main camp from multiple directions. They used water cannons despite sub-zero temperatures, fired stun grenades into crowds, and beat anyone they could catch. Protesters defended their barricades with desperate ferocity, hurling paving stones and Molotov cocktails. The center of Kyiv became a war zone. Buildings burned, the air filled with smoke and the sound of explosions. International television broadcast images that shocked the world. A European capital city descending into chaos. A government war against its own citizens. But the worst was yet to come. February 20th, 2014, would become known as the bloodiest day in Ukraine's post-Soviet history. That morning, security forces prepared for what appeared to be a final assault to clear the Maidan. Protesters, exhausted from days of fighting and knowing this might be the end, prepared to defend their camp to the death. What happened next was not just riot control gone wrong. It was systematic massacre. Snipers positioned in buildings overlooking Institutska Street and the Maidan began firing on protesters with hunting rifles. These were not warning shots or rubber bullets. These were kill shots, aimed at heads and chests. One by one, protesters fell. A young man would step forward to help someone wounded, and a bullet would strike him down. Medics wearing clearly visible red crosses were shot. A priest giving last rites to the dying was targeted. The shooting continued for hours. Videos from that day show surreal, horrifying scenes. Bodies lying in the street, while other protesters tried to shield themselves behind pieces of metal and scraps of wood that offered no real protection against high-powered rifles. The crack of gunfire echoed constantly. Blood stained the snow red. By the end of February 20th, at least 48 protesters were dead from gunfire, with dozens more dying later from their wounds. The final toll from those 3 days in February reached 76 civilian deaths. Another 13 police officers died, some shot by armed protesters who had acquired weapons, others possibly victims of the same snipers who targeted demonstrators. More than 800 people suffered injuries ranging from bullet wounds to severe beatings to burns. Who ordered the massacre? This question would consume Ukrainian investigators for years afterward. The evidence overwhelmingly points to a coordinated operation authorized at the highest levels of government. Snipers do not randomly appear in strategic positions with high-powered weapons. The coordination between different security forces, Berkut, Interior Ministry troops, and the snipers, indicated central planning. Witnesses and surviving security personnel testified that orders came down through clear chains of command. And at the top of that chain sat Viktor Yanukovych, president and commander-in-chief, operating from his compound at Mezhyhirya. Yanukovych would later claim, from the safety of Russian exile, that he never ordered violence against protesters. He suggested the snipers were provocateurs working for the opposition, trying to create martyrs and justify a coup. He pointed to the fact that both protesters and police died as evidence of some third force at work. These claims are not credible. The weight of evidence, ballistic analysis, witness testimony, intercepted communications, documented chains of command, all indicate that the shooting was organized by elements within the government security apparatus, following orders that came from Yanukovych's administration. The massacre on Institutska Street proved to be Yanukovych's fatal miscalculation. Instead of breaking the protesters' will, the bloodshed enraged the nation. Even members of his own party of regents began abandoning him. Foreign governments condemned the violence in the strongest terms. The EU and United States announced sanctions. Most critically, ordinary Ukrainians who had been watching from the sidelines now concluded their president was a murderer who had to go. The regime's legitimacy evaporated in pools of blood on Kyiv's streets. On February 21st, with his position collapsing, Yanukovych agreed to a deal brokered by European diplomats. He would sign an agreement with opposition leaders calling for early elections, formation of a unity government, and constitutional reforms. The agreement was witnessed by foreign ministers from Poland, Germany, and France. For a few hours, it seemed the crisis might end peacefully. Yanukovych signed the document. Opposition leaders, though skeptical, agreed to present the deal to protesters on the Maidan. But the Maidan rejected the agreement. The crowd that evening was in no mood for compromise with a man who had just ordered their friends and children killed. They wanted Yanukovych gone immediately, not in some future election. They wanted justice, not negotiations. The opposition leaders who tried to sell the deal were shouted down. The message was clear. Yanukovych must leave, now, or the bloodshed would continue. And Yanukovych, realizing he had lost control completely, made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would run. The exact timeline of Yanukovych's flight remains somewhat murky, pieced together from witness accounts, security camera footage, and later testimony. What is clear is that late on the night of February 21st, Yanukovych left Mezhyhirya. He did not leave alone. A convoy of vehicles departed the compound heading east. Security forces loyal to the president provided escort. The convoy's first destination was apparently Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city and a traditional stronghold of Yanukovych's party of regions in the country's east. He may have hoped to establish a rival power center there, to claim that he remained the legitimate president even as Kyiv fell to the opposition. But Kharkiv did not rally to him. By February 22nd, as news of his flight spread, the Ukrainian parliament was already moving to strip him of power. Deputies voted overwhelmingly to remove Yanukovych from office, citing his abandonment of presidential duties. They also voted to free Yulia Tymoshenko, the opposition leader Yanukovych had imprisoned on dubious charges. The parliament appointed an interim president. A new government began forming. Whatever Yanukovych had hoped to accomplish by fleeing to eastern Ukraine, it was not working. He was not gathering a loyalist movement. He was simply a fugitive president with a dwindling number of places to run. From Kharkiv, Yanukovych continued east and south, apparently heading for Crimea. Witnesses reported seeing his convoy near Donetsk, his home base. At some point during this chaotic journey, he tried to leave by air from Donetsk airport, but airport staff, already aware that the government in Kyiv had issued orders for his arrest, refused to allow the departure. The plan fell apart. Yanukovych and his remaining security detail got back in their vehicles and continued toward the Russian border. The final stage of the escape took Yanukovych to Balaklava in Crimea, where he had access to a boat or helicopter, accounts vary, that could take him across the Black Sea to Russia. By February 23rd or 24th, he was in Russian territory, in the city of Rostov-on-Don, near the Ukrainian border. On February 28th, he appeared at a press conference in Rostov, looking shaken and defiant. He wore a dark suit, spoke in Russian rather than Ukrainian, and insisted he remained Ukraine's legitimate president. He called the Maidan movement a coup. He claimed his life was in danger from extremists. He demanded international intervention to restore constitutional order. It was a bizarre performance from a man who had just fled his country after ordering the deaths of dozens of his own citizens. But Yanukovych was not content simply to flee and fade into obscurity. On March 1, 2014, he took an action that would provide the justification for one of the most consequential geopolitical events of the 21st century. From Russian territory, he wrote a letter addressed to Russian President Vladimir Putin. In this letter, Yanukovych requested that Russia use its armed forces to restore law and order in Ukraine, particularly to protect Russian speakers in Crimea and eastern Ukraine from what he characterized as nationalist extremists who had seized power in Kyiv. He claimed chaos reigned in Ukraine, that his life and the lives of Russian-speaking citizens were in danger, and that only Russian military intervention could stabilize the situation. This letter was precisely what Putin needed. On March 3rd, Russia's representative to the United Nations Security Council read Yanukovych's letter aloud, using it as legal justification for what was already happening. Russian military forces were seizing control of Crimea. Little green men, Russian soldiers in unmarked uniforms, had appeared throughout the Crimean Peninsula. They surrounded Ukrainian military bases. They took control of government buildings. They blocked roads and communications. Within days, Russia had effective control of Crimea, despite the presence of thousands of Ukrainian troops stationed there. On March 16th, after Russian forces had been occupying Crimea for 2 weeks, a hastily organized referendum was held. The ballot offered Crimean residents essentially 2 choices: join Russia or restore Crimea's 1992 constitution, which gave it significant autonomy from Ukraine. There was no option to maintain the status quo as part of Ukraine under the current constitution. International observers condemned the referendum as illegitimate, conducted at gunpoint under foreign military occupation. Nevertheless, Russian authorities claimed overwhelming support for joining Russia. On March 18th, Putin signed documents formally annexing Crimea into the Russian Federation. Yanukovych's letter had given Putin a fig leaf of legality. The Russian narrative became, "We were invited by Ukraine's legitimate president to protect citizens from chaos and fascism." Never mind that Yanukovych was a discredited fugitive whose own parliament had stripped him of authority. Never mind that there was no actual chaos threatening Russian speakers in Crimea. The violence had occurred in Kyiv, and the new government had not threatened minorities. The letter existed, and Russia used it to justify the first forcible annexation of European territory since World War II. But Crimea was only the beginning. In April 2014, armed groups began seizing government buildings in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region, specifically in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, Yanukovych's home territory. These groups claimed to be local activists resisting the new government in Kyiv, but evidence quickly mounted that they were organized, armed, and led by Russian intelligence operatives and military personnel. Sophisticated weapons appeared that local volunteers could not possibly have acquired. The separatists' leaders included Russian citizens with backgrounds in Russian security services. Communications intercepts revealed coordination with Moscow. By summer 2014, a full-scale war was raging in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian military fought to retake territory seized by Russian-backed separatists. Russia provided weapons, training, and eventually regular military forces operating officially as volunteers. Thousands died in the fighting. Towns and cities were shelled. Civilian infrastructure was destroyed. In July 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was shot down over separatist-controlled territory by a Russian-supplied anti-aircraft missile system, killing all 298 people aboard. The war that began with Yanukovych's letter and Russia's annexation of Crimea would eventually claim over 14,000 lives in the Donbas, displace millions, and fundamentally reshape European security. And where was Viktor Yanukovych during all this? After his press conference in Rostov, he disappeared from public view for months. Reports placed him in various locations around Russia. He was supposedly in Moscow, then possibly in Sochi, then maybe back near the Ukrainian border. The Russian government initially claims to have no particular interest in protecting him, treating him as simply a private individual who had sought temporary refuge. But this was disingenuous. Yanukovych clearly enjoyed official protection. He was too useful to Russia as the legitimate president, whose letter justified intervention. He could not simply be abandoned. By late 2014 and into 2015, it became clear that Yanukovych had settled in the Moscow region, specifically in the elite suburb of Barvika. This village, located in the Odintsevo district of Moscow Oblast, about 20 kilometers west of central Moscow, represents the absolute pinnacle of Russian wealth and power. It is home to oligarchs worth billions, to top government officials, to Putin's own inner circle. Properties in Barvika sell for tens of millions of dollars. Security is omnipresent. Privacy is absolute. It was the perfect hiding place for a fugitive president who still had money and still had powerful protectors. Yanukovych's son, Alexander, also ended up in Russia, where he quietly continued business operations. The younger Yanukovych had the foresight, or guilt, to move significant assets out of Ukraine before and during the Maidan crisis. He obtained Russian citizenship, as did his father. Alexander's primary business became energy trading, specifically selling coal extracted from the occupied territories of Donbas. Through his company, Energoresurs, and related entities, Alexander Yanukovych profited from the war his father had helped start. Open-source investigations tracked coal shipments from mines in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic through Russia to customers in various countries. Over 2 years, these operations generated an estimated $35 million in revenue. The Yanukovych family, having looted Ukraine while in power, now profited from its dismemberment. The other son, Viktor Jr., never made it to enjoy exile. His death on Lake Baikal in March 2015 removed him from the story permanently. The official Russian account described it as a tragic accident. Viktor and friends were driving vehicles on the frozen lake when ice gave way. But the circumstances raised questions. Why were they driving on ice in the first place? Had there been alcohol involved? Some speculated that Viktor's death might not have been entirely accidental, that he knew too much or had become a liability. No evidence ever emerged to support such theories, but in the murky world of Russian exile politics, accidental deaths are always suspicious. Back in Ukraine, the new government moved to hold Yanukovych accountable. The Prosecutor General's office opened multiple criminal investigations. The charges were staggering: high treason for calling on Russia to invade, aiding and abetting Russian aggression, responsibility for the Maidan massacre, embezzlement of state funds, abuse of power, illegal seizure of property. Each investigation produced volumes of evidence. Prosecutors interviewed hundreds of witnesses, collected thousands of documents, traced financial transactions through offshore networks, and documented the systematic corruption of the Yanukovych regime. In 2016, the International Criminal Court announced it was examining events in Ukraine, including the Maidan violence and subsequent war, to determine if crimes within the court's jurisdiction had occurred. Interpol issued a red notice for Yanukovych, an international wanted person alert distributed to police forces worldwide. His assets in Ukraine began to be frozen and confiscated. Bank accounts were emptied into state coffers. Properties were seized. The Mezhyhirya compound was officially nationalized and opened as a public park, allowing ordinary Ukrainians to walk through the palace of corruption and see for themselves how their president had lived. But seizing assets and issuing arrest warrants meant little while Yanukovych remained safely in Russia. Moscow refused all extradition requests. Russian officials insisted that Yanukovych was simply a private individual exercising his right to reside where he chose. They ignored the Interpol notices, the Ukrainian arrest warrants, the international condemnation. Russia had invested too much in the narrative that Yanukovych was Ukraine's legitimate president, overthrown by a Western-backed coup. Returning him to face justice would contradict that story, and besides, having Yanukovych available as a potential puppet leader remained useful to Moscow, even if his actual political future in Ukraine was non-existent. Life in Barvikha offered Yanukovych everything except the one thing he truly lost: relevance. The mansion, worth an estimated $50 million, was comfortable, certainly. The private grounds with their forest setting, the security preventing any unwanted visitors, the proximity to Moscow's amenities, all very nice. He could play tennis on his private court, though a reported injury during a match in 2018 left him hospitalized. He could host the few friends and family members who still associated with him. He received a Russian passport and pension. By material measures, he was fine. But he was also utterly finished as a political figure. The Ukrainian people had moved on. His party of regions collapsed after Maidan, with most members either fleeing abroad, facing criminal charges, or rebranding themselves to escape association with the disgraced president. Younger Ukrainians knew Yanukovych only as a symbol of corruption and betrayal. The war his letter had helped justify was hardening Ukrainian national identity in ways that made any pro-Russian politician toxic. Even in eastern Ukraine, once his stronghold, public opinion turned against him as people buried their dead and rebuilt their bombed cities. Yanukovych occasionally released video statements, invariably in Russian, invariably blaming the West and Ukrainian nationalists for all problems, invariably claiming he remained the legitimate president. Nobody cared. These statements generated mockery on social media, but no serious political discussion. He was a ghost, a historical figure who happened to still be alive, living in comfortable exile while the country he had ruled tried to recover from the damage he had inflicted. In September 2025, Yanukovych appeared in another video. This one notable mainly because it showed he had undergone extensive dental work. His smile was suddenly much whiter and straighter than in previous appearances. He looked healthier, perhaps, but also somehow diminished. The expensive dental work seemed pathetic given the circumstances, like polishing a turd. Here was a man who had reached the absolute pinnacle of power in a nation of 45 million people, who had lived like a king in his palace, and who now spent his time getting cosmetic dentistry in Russian exile, while Ukrainian prosecutors added more charges to his ever-growing list of crimes. For Yanukovych, Barvikha represents the best possible circumstances of exile. He has wealth, not as much as he stole, since Ukrainian and international sanctions have frozen many assets, but enough to live extremely well. He has security. Russian state protection ensures no Ukrainian agents or Interpol officers will ever reach him. He has comfort. The mansion provides everything material wealth can buy. What he lacks is freedom. He cannot leave Russia. Traveling to any country with an Interpol agreement would risk arrest. Even Belarus, Russia's closest ally, would be risky. He is, for all practical purposes, under house arrest in a very large, very nice house. His daily routine, pieced together from occasional visitor accounts and surveillance by Ukrainian intelligence, apparently follows a repetitive pattern. He wakes late, breakfasts alone or with family, reads Russian news and propaganda that reinforces his narrative of victimhood. He may meet with the few remaining associates who still visit, former Ukrainian officials now also in Russian exile, some Russian officials who maintain contact for whatever strategic purposes Moscow has. He watches television, particularly Russian state channels that present Ukraine as a failed state controlled by fascists. He plays cards or board games. He may work out in his gym, though the back injury limited his physical activity. Occasionally, he records video statements for release online, though these generate less attention each time. His family situation is fragmented. His ex-wife Lyudmila lives separately, reportedly in occupied Crimea, maintaining distance from the controversy that surrounds her former husband. They divorced in 2016, though the split had been effective for years before that. Lyudmila apparently wanted no part of either the spotlight or the infamy. She lives quietly, on a pension and whatever financial arrangements were made in the divorce, keeping her name out of news reports. She has never publicly commented on her ex-husband's crimes or given interviews about their life together. Son Alexander remains in Russia, nominally residing in Moscow but traveling frequently for business. His coal trading operation continues to generate revenue from occupied Donbass. The business model is straightforward and utterly immoral. Mines in the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, operated by Russian-backed separatist authorities, produce coal using equipment and labor in territories Ukraine considers illegally occupied. This coal is sold at below-market rates to Alexander's company Energoresurs. The coal is then exported, often through Russian ports, to buyers in Europe and Asia, who either do not care about its origins or believe false documentation claiming it came from Russia proper. The profit margin is substantial, buying cheap from occupied territories and selling at market prices globally. Over just 2 years, open-source investigations tracked approximately $35 million in revenue flowing through this network. Viktor Yanukovych faces his own criminal charges in Ukraine, his own international sanctions, his own asset freezes. But unlike his father, he is younger, more mobile, and less politically toxic. He obtained Russian citizenship easily. He maintains a lower profile than Viktor Sr. He could potentially outlive the current political situation and someday rehabilitate his reputation, or at least fade into the background of Russian elite society. For now, he profits from the war his father helped start, selling resources stolen from Ukrainian soil. The death of younger son Viktor in 2015 remains one of the stranger footnotes to the Yanukovych saga. The official Russian account describes a recreational trip to Lake Baikal gone wrong. Viktor and several friends drove vehicles onto the frozen lake, a popular winter activity in Siberia, where the ice grows thick enough to support trucks. Something went wrong. Whether they misjudged ice thickness, whether there was mechanical failure, whether alcohol impaired judgment, the ice broke. Viktor's vehicle sank into the freezing water. He drowned before rescue could arrive. His body was recovered and returned to the family. The funeral was private. No investigation suggested foul play. Yet, in the paranoid world of Russian exile politics, accidents are never just accidents. Some speculated that Viktor knew too much about family finances, about money hidden in offshore accounts, about deals made with Russian authorities. Others suggested he had become unreliable, perhaps using drugs or alcohol too heavily, perhaps talking too freely. The conspiracy theories never produced evidence. Most likely, it was exactly what it appeared to be: a tragic accident. A young man dying in a stupid way. The kind of senseless death that happens to people regardless of their family's political situation. But the Yanukovych name ensured that even this personal tragedy became fodder for speculation and rumor. By 2026, Yanukovych had been in exile for 12 years. 12 years of living in a foreign country, unable to return home, his assets seized, his reputation destroyed, his political legacy reduced to a symbol of corruption and betrayal. 12 years of watching Ukraine move on without him, seeing his party of regions collapse and scatter, witnessing the rise of new politicians who built their careers partly on opposition to everything he represented. 12 years of accumulating prison sentences he would likely never serve, of seeing his properties confiscated, of being named in international sanctions lists, of having his face associated with terms like kleptocrat and traitor. The convictions kept coming because Ukrainian prosecutors understood several things. First, each trial created a permanent historical record. When future historians study this period, they will have detailed court documents explaining exactly what Yanukovych did and why it was criminal. Second, each conviction provided legal basis for additional asset seizures. Even if most of Yanukovych's wealth was beyond reach in Russia or hidden in offshore accounts, any property anywhere in the world with proper legal systems could potentially be frozen or confiscated based on these criminal convictions. Third, the continued prosecutions maintained pressure. Yanukovych could never relax, never feel that the past was truly past. Every new trial was a reminder that Ukraine had not forgotten and would not forgive. The prosecutions also served victims' families. The Heavenly Hundred, those who died on Maidan, left behind parents, spouses, children. These families wanted more than just memorials and anniversaries. They wanted legal accountability. They wanted the person responsible to be convicted, even if he could not be imprisoned. Each verdict provided some measure of closure, some official acknowledgement that their loved ones had been murdered by state violence ordered from the top. When courts convicted Yanukovych for treason, it validated their belief that he had betrayed not just them personally, but the entire nation. The December 2022 confiscation order, which seized essentially everything Yanukovych owned in Ukraine, represented the culmination of this long legal process. The state now owned Mezhyhirya completely. The 537 cultural treasures were in government custody. The shell companies that had held properties were dissolved, their assets nationalized. The financial accounts were emptied. Yanukovych's accumulated wealth, at least the portion physically located in Ukraine, had been stripped away. Prosecutors estimated the total value at well over $200 million, though the exact figure was difficult to calculate given the unique nature of some items and the inflated valuations in real estate. Mezhyhirya itself became a powerful symbol and tourist attraction. The compound was designated as a museum park open to public visits. Ukrainians could walk the same grounds where Yanukovych had strolled, see the same buildings where he had lived in luxury, view the same possessions he had accumulated through corruption. The exhibits were designed to educate, explaining how each building was financed, documenting the shell companies and false paperwork, showing photographs of the luxury contrasted with images of ordinary Ukrainian poverty during the same period. School groups visited on educational trips. Foreign journalists toured it when reporting on Ukrainian corruption. The golden toilet became the museum's unofficial symbol, a single bathroom fixture that represented everything wrong with kleptocratic governance. But while Ukraine seized what it could, vast amounts of Yanukovych's wealth remained inaccessible. Money in Russian banks, funds in offshore jurisdictions that do not cooperate with Ukrainian requests, properties in countries that do not recognize Ukrainian court judgments, business interests held through nominees and shell companies, impossible to trace definitively back to Yanukovych. The total amount he successfully smuggled out of Ukraine, either before or during his flight in 2014, will likely never be known. Estimates range from hundreds of millions to billions of dollars. Some of this money funds his current lifestyle in Barvikha, Some is hidden away for future use or to pass to his surviving son. Some may have been lost in bad investments or seized by Russian partners who saw an opportunity to steal from a fugitive with no recourse. In his rare public statements, Yanukovych maintains a consistent narrative. He was Ukraine's legitimate president, illegally removed by a Western-backed coup. The Maidan protests were organized by NATO and CIA operatives seeking to pull Ukraine away from Russia's sphere of influence. The violence was provoked by opposition extremists who shot their own people to create martyrs and justify overthrowing the government. He never ordered security forces to kill protesters. His letter to Putin was a desperate attempt to prevent civil war, not an invitation for invasion. Everything bad that happened in Ukraine after February 2014, the war in Donbass, the economic crisis, the political instability, resulted from the illegal coup, not from his actions or Russian aggression. This narrative is, of course, completely contradicted by evidence, but it serves Yanukovych's psychological needs, allowing him to see himself as victim rather than villain. It also serves Russian propaganda purposes, supporting Moscow's preferred story about Ukraine. And it provides some small comfort to the few remaining Yanukovych loyalists who need to believe their leader was wronged, rather than admit they supported a corrupt, murderous regime. The September 2025 video, with its display of expensive dental work, crystallized something pathetic about Yanukovych's current existence. Here was a man who once commanded a nation, who lived in a palace worth hundreds of millions, who had the power to order people imprisoned or killed. Now he was reduced to making occasional internet videos that almost nobody watched, showing off his new teeth, like that somehow demonstrated his continued vitality and relevance. The dental work probably cost tens of thousands of dollars. It looked good. But it could not disguise the essential hollowness of his situation. A fugitive playing pretend in a gilded cage, growing old and irrelevant while the country he betrayed tried to recover from the damage he had inflicted. The arc of Viktor Yanukovych's life spans from the poorest reaches of Soviet working-class existence to the absolute pinnacle of post-Soviet corruption, and finally, to comfortable but meaningless exile. Born in poverty, orphaned young, raised without advantages, he might have been sympathetic if his response to hardship had been to develop empathy for other struggling people. Instead, he learned that power and money were the only things that mattered, that rules existed to be broken by those strong or connected enough to break them, that loyalty meant less than self-interest, and that you should take everything you can get away with taking. His two early criminal convictions should have ended any political career before it started. The mysterious erasure of those convictions, whether through legitimate legal review, corruption, or KGB interference, gave him an undeserved second chance. Rather than using that chance to serve his country honorably, he used it to build a criminal enterprise disguised as a government. The teenage gang member who robbed people in Donetsk simply scaled up his operations. Instead of stealing wallets, he stole an entire nation's resources. Instead of threatening victims with fists, he used police and courts and presidential decrees. The essential character never changed, only the means and the magnitude. The final accounting of Yanukovych's crimes extends beyond what any court can address. Yes, he is guilty of treason, of aiding foreign aggression, of embezzlement, of abuse of power, of seizing state property. But he is also responsible for broken families who lost sons and daughters on Maidan, for traumatized protesters who watched friends bleed to death on Kiev's streets, for Ukrainian soldiers who died fighting Russian-backed forces in Donbass, for civilians caught in shelling and crossfire, for refugees forced from homes in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, for the general erosion of trust in government that corruption creates, for the example he set that power exists to enrich the powerful rather than serve the public. His 43 years of prison sentences will almost certainly never be served. He is 75 years old. Russia will not extradite him. He will not voluntarily return to Ukraine. He will most likely die in exile, probably in that Barvika mansion, surrounded by whatever family and associates remain. When that day comes, Ukrainian media will report it with a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. Satisfaction that he is gone, frustration that he never faced actual imprisonment. There will be no state funeral, no honors, no tributes from current leaders. His grave will likely be in Russia, perhaps with a simple marker, perhaps intentionally obscure to prevent vandalism. The historical verdict is already written, though it will continue to be refined as more evidence emerges and scholars study the period. Viktor Yanukovych will be remembered as Ukraine's only president with a criminal past who added massive new crimes while in office. As the president who ordered the deaths of his own citizens for protesting peacefully. As the president who invited a foreign power to invade his country rather than accept his political defeat. As a symbol of post-Soviet corruption at its most grotesque. As a cautionary tale about what happens when societies allow criminals to reach positions of authority. As a man who had every opportunity to serve honorably, but chose instead to steal, to kill, and to betray. The stolen artwork has been recovered and will someday hang in museums, properly appreciated. The Mezhyhirya Palace teaches new generations about the costs of corruption. The court records document everything for history. Ukraine has moved on, building new institutions, electing new leaders, fighting for its independence and European future. And Viktor Yanukovych sits in Barvika, comfortable but caged, wealthy but worthless, alive but dead to history, waiting for an end that will come too easily for a man whose crimes deserve far worse than a comfortable exile.